From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Ron Charles, editor of Book World at the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. We're delighted to have you here. Our guest this afternoon is the science fiction and fantasy author David Weber. David was raised in South Carolina. And he'd always intended on becoming a history professor. But the universe had an alternate history in store for him. Early in his career, he took over the family advertising business for several years and started writing. That work eventually led him to do some war game design with Task Force Games out of Texas. And to design those games, he started writing short stories to plot out the action. It's a classic example of how every experience becomes valuable to a future writer's life, because Weber's work on war games got him thinking about future history and how to go about building a literary universe. That experience eventually led him to his first published novel, Insurrection, written with Steve White. Other novels followed: The Apocalypse Troll, Mutineer's Moon, The Armageddon Inheritance, and his work eventually branched into several celebrated series, including the Honor Harrington series, the War Gods series, the Safehold series, and the Tales of Honor graphic novel series. He's now published, he just told me, 61 books, but he said there were others too that he'd kind of lost track of. His latest War Gods novel is The Sword of the South. And a new Safehold novel will be released in October called Hell's Foundations Quiver. Please join me in welcoming David Weber.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me? All right. One thing that I've never really found it difficult to do is to fill up any odd moments of silence by talking. So, if anybody notices that I'm getting in that direction, just, Sharon's here. She'll help you throw something at me if that's the best way to get my attention. When I was in college, I intended to write history to teach history and to write on the side. That was after I had decided that I wasn't going to go into seminary, which was the other place that I thought about going. There was a third option. I considered becoming an attorney, and I kind of thought as seminary and law as the reverse opposite poles of endeavor. So I thought I would settle for history, but I was working on my master's degree, and I saw a demographic study that said that over half of all tenured history positions were held by people who were 40 or younger, which explained to me why some of the professors that I had at Appalachian State University were there instead of UC Berkeley or one of the other really big schools. So at that point, I decided I should seek a career change. And I went back home and I took over the ad agency that my mom had created. She was moving down to Georgia to look after her mother, who at that point was in her early 80s, and who lived until she was 101 and a half. So this was my mom really and truly wound up in Georgia longer than she thought she was going to be. So I took over Words of Weber, Weber Associates, excuse me. And it was an easy move for me because I had supported myself by writing from the time I was 17. I started writing when I was in probably the 5th grade, writing poetry primarily. I think that's where a lot of people start, is with poetry rather than fiction. Then in the 8th grade, my friend Terry Maurer and I wrote a really terrible novel that was probably, I'm guessing, somewhere around 850,000 words. This was pre-computer, of course, so we did it all on my little Royal Corona portable typewriter. And we would type until it turned gray, then we type in red, then we turn the ribbon over and type some more. And it was basically David and Terry Save the World. And I actually came across a few pages from it, maybe 40, a couple of years ago, and promptly burned them because they were really bad. But it was where I got started. And then I was a typesetter. I am one of the world's last trained linotype operators. Back in Y2K, I thought I saw a new career opportunity returning, but no, the computer survived. I've done paste-up art. I have written ad copy. I've written magazine articles. I've written travel articles. I've written annual reports. And when I couldn't get honest work, I've even worked political campaigns. So pretty much writing was a huge part of who I was even then. Now, the first novel, Insurrection, actually came about because, as they said in the introduction, I did short stories when I was designing a new wargame product to kind of set the tone for the product in my mind. And I sent the first story for a game which was going to be called The Fourth Interstellar War. I sent to my friend Steve White, and he said, ooh, and he sent a short story back to me, and I sent a short story back to him, and he sent a short story back to me, and I sent, and we realized that what we were actually writing were chapters in a novel, the spine of which was organized by the war game I was designing, but the characters of whom were taking on a life of their own. And when my friend Jane Linskold was up here earlier today, she was talking about John Douglas, the guy who bought her first book. Well, John was the senior editor at Avon when Steve and I finished our massive missive. I realized it was probably a little long, so I cut 100,000 words out of it before we submitted it, which got it down to 186,000. You know, a mere small, tome. So I sent it to Avon, and it languished there for about 6 months with me sending a letter every month saying, I don't know, I haven't heard anything. Finally, I sent them a letter that said, well, guys, I haven't heard anything from you, so if I don't hear anything from you in the next, couple of weeks, just consider it withdrawn and I'll go somewhere else. And I got this letter from John Douglas, and he said, I am so sorry, the editor who was assigned this book when it came in has left us, and it's just been sitting on his desk. And nobody in the mail office was forwarding his letters to anybody here until this one came in. They said, oh, we probably better tell them he's withdrawing the book. And he said, so could I please have a couple of weeks to look at it because I feel really bad that I haven't looked at it. Now, this is an over-the-transit submission. There's no agent. And so I'm like, yeah, sure. So he loved it, but he couldn't buy it because the suits in the front office would not let him buy a 185,000-word novel from two complete unknowns. So I worked with John for a year trying to reduce it to something that they would let him buy purely because of word count considerations. And we finally got it down to 135,000 words. And the problem was it was still too long. They wouldn't let him buy it. And John said, you have taken everything out of this book that we can take out. And everybody's read it, everybody loves it, and if you start taking more out, you're going to be taking out skeleton. You've already cut out all the fat and some of the muscle. He said, so I hate it because you've been working with us so patiently on this for like a year, but they're just not going to let me buy it. So what I would recommend that you do is that you withdraw it. You submit it to some place that publishes more military-themed science fiction. And tell them that the only reason that I didn't buy it was that the front office wouldn't let me and that they should call me so I can tell them that myself. As rejection letters come, it doesn't get much better than that, okay? So I submitted it to this outfit called Bain Books, which at that point had been in existence, I think, for maybe 3 years. And less than a week later, I get this phone call, and this voice on the other end says, hi, this is Tony Weisskopf with Bain Books, and we'd like to buy your book. I said, okay. And she said, don't you want to know how much? I said, no. No, not for the first one, kind of thing. And within a year and a half, Bain had bought that one and 4 solo novels. And so I was able to make the transition to a full-time writer a lot more quickly than most people are able to do. Now, one reason they were able to buy 4 novels is that I just happened to have 3 more sitting there. Okay, that helped, you know. But I have found that no one can teach you to be a storyteller. They can teach you to be, you can learn writing techniques from other people. You can be taught that. And all of us assimilate all of the all the writing styles we've ever read ourselves, become involved in our own voice, either because we adopt something from this other person, or perhaps because we say, well, that's something I'm never going to do, you know, kind of thing. But the storyteller bite, the thing that makes you have to tell stories, that I think nobody can teach you. Now, when Jane was up here this morning, she commented on the fact that she had been in isolate as a child, and that she thought that that was something that most successful writers and storytellers experienced. I'm not sure that I completely agree with her. I think it's something that an awful lot of us have experienced, and I think probably the majority of us have had that sense of being different from the world around us as we perceive it, even if we're deeply involved in it. And in that sense, I think she's absolutely right. I also think that storytelling and writing are very much like a physical skill. I've had people ask me, how did you learn to write? And my response to them, and I'm not trying to be Zen, but my response to them is, how did you learn to walk? Because I learned to write so long ago that I remember the process about as well as I remember learning how to walk. But also because there are such similarities between the two. When you learn to walk, you fall down a lot. And each time you fall down, you learn a little bit more about keeping your balance and moving forward. The same thing is true of writing. When you begin to write, you write a lot of really bad stuff. Okay, now, for where you are at that point, for example, what I was writing in the 5th grade was really, really bad. But for a 5th grader, it wasn't that bad, okay? But you fill a lot, you fill a lot of trash cans. These days, you just delete a lot of files. So I don't want to date myself here. But I have a file drawer at home, 3-drawer file. I have this entire file drawer, which is full of nothing but short stories that I never wrote with any eye towards publication. I don't want them to be published. Most of them are studies of particular things that I wanted to play with in that story. So I think of them as learning exercises. But the reason that it's like a physical skill is that the more you do it, the better you become at it, unless you move into the rut area of writing, where you are no longer growing or changing or expanding. I think series writers, and I'm one of them, have a greater vulnerability to that than people who write standalones, because for someone who writes a standalone, each book is a unique project. For those of us who write series, the books are unique products within a continuum that is linked. And that, frankly, is one reason why I do as many series as I do, because it allows me to move from this series to that series and back again, rather than getting just locked in narrow focus on one series of books and one series of characters. But I think that one thing we have a responsibility to remember as writers is that the moment you begin to write, you step up onto a soapbox, whether that's your intention or not. because who you are and what you believe and how you think is going to infuse everything that you write. And you cannot help it. But I think that you need to be aware, in as much as you can be, of that element in your writing. I write military science fiction. And the truth is that the majority of American citizens have very limited personal experience with violence. We talk about a violent society, a violent culture. But the truth is that very few of us do, and those of us who do tend to be, unfortunately, concentrated in certain segments of the population. So for the average reader of my work, the experience that they have with physical violence is going to be vicarious. What they see on the news, what they read in their books, what they see in the movies, etc. And I think that if you're going to write military fiction, you have to play fair with violence. I abhor what I think of as splatter porn, where the hero wades through bodies stacked 30 deep and comes out the other end, except for the blood stains on their boots, totally unchanged. But by the same token, I despise military fiction where the violence is so sanitized that it is not a factor in the characters' lives. And I think that's one of my responsibilities as a writer if I'm going to take this as my subject matter. And in an odd way, I think of it as a responsibility not just to my readership, but to the people in the military who have actually experienced that violence and who do not need or deserve to have their experience trivialized by someone writing about it in stories for other people. So there are elements of me as a writer which tie into that sense of responsibility both to my readership as a craftsman and to my own moral duty, responsibility, if you will, as a writer. But even when I do my job correctly, the truth is that no one in the entire world has ever read a single book I've written. They've read a book that I wrote from their personal experiential viewpoint. And that means that it is a different book for every single person who's ever read it. Every single reader of the Honor Harrington novels sees honor differently, and not just physically. Every single reader of the Safehold books is going to have a different take on the Church of God Awaiting, on Merlin Athros and the other members of the Inner Circle. And the reason for that is that storytelling is the first interactive art form, and it always has been. I think that we lose a little bit of that in cinema because the reader, the viewer, is inundated in a visual matrix, a visual cortex, and a context that precludes some of that personal perspective on what's going on. Now, that's certainly not true in the best cinema, but I'm saying that it happens a lot. And that is one of the huge advantages that literary fiction has over other forms that we perceive. One of the things that I've observed is that there are people who find their entertainment through different channels. There's the reading public, which I suspect is heavily represented in this room at the moment. And there are those who prefer, for example, an electronic interface. Personally, and this may be showing my personal bias, I don't know. Personally, I think that by and large, literary fiction as entertainment is more challenging and gives you a bigger payback than the electronic media do. Now, Sharon and I have a very dear friend, Shannon Willis, who both reads but who is a huge, huge film buff. If I ever have a question about a film, I call Shannon. You know, don't have to go to IMDb. I just call Shannon. She's got it. Okay. And I think that she is as discerning an audience cinematically as most readers are on literary entertainment, but it's still a different platform. It's still a different experience. I can remember the very first science fiction novel that I ever read. I can remember the first two that I ever read. I was 10 years old. I had broken an arm. I had already read all of Walter Farley's Black Stallions novels. I had already read all of the You Were There at the Battle of Lexington and Concord and whatever novels. And I was desperate. So I went to my dad's shelf and I found this book called The Legion of Space by Jack Williamson, written in, I think, 1939. I was 10, so it was 1962. Yes, I'm that old. And I was like, wow, that was so cool. So I went and looked, and the next book that I found was something called Genus Homo by P. Schuler Mitchell and Sprague de Camp. If you've never read either of those books, I recommend them highly. They're definitely dated, but they're still good stories. Because Williamson and Mitchell and DeCamp had the ingredient, the magic ingredient necessary for all successful storytelling. They had characters that you actually cared about. But they also had the matrix of the could it really be that way element, which is so huge in science fiction even today. I cannot tell you the number of NASA scientists I've talked to who have told me that science fiction is the reason they went into the sciences and how they wound up at NASA. It's just an incredible, incredible percentage of them. Because science fiction is what stretches the bounds of the possible. I do fantasy as well. I have 4, I think, fantasy novels out. I think it's 5 with Sword of the South, which just came out. And I really, really like fantasy. And I think that fantasy and science fiction are twins, fraternal twins. They both serve the same function that fairy tales have always served. They're cautionary tales, they're teaching tales, they're inspirational tales. Science fiction is what you might think of as fairy tales told with the tropes of a technological society. Instead of dryads and wizards, you have artificial intelligences and scientists. Fantasy is still told with more of the traditional fantasy / fairy tale elements. Then there's urban fantasy, which is kind of a fusion of the two. And I'm sure we could parse the genres and come up with a whole lot of other labels, but I think that's the main difference. The thing that science fiction has going for it that fantasy doesn't is that in fantasy you're writing about a world that you know can't be. Because you have magic in it, you have all this other stuff in it. In science fiction, you're writing about a world that could be. And I think that's where the speculative label for science fiction comes from, and I think where it comes into play. And either one of them works, as long as you are able to give the reader those people that he cares about, or she cares about, and give them things to do that involve the reader in why are they important to do. I think that one of the advantages of fantasy, frankly, is that it's easier in fantasy for us to portray good and evil. And the reason I say that is human beings are partisan creatures. You may have noticed recently that there's, I don't know, minor political furor debate, going on. But in anything that is too closely connected to the where we might go world, it's really hard for us to step back from our own partisan perspectives right now. In fantasy, it's much easier for the readers to agree, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, because you're not already invested in one side or the other. Once you've done that, you can have gray characters, you can have gray problems, you can make everything work. But there's a clarity, a lack of ambiguity, I think, in who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in fantasy. I could be wrong about that, but in talking to my readers, that's something that I have heard again and again. And I think that, as I said earlier, you step up onto a soapbox. Somebody asked me one time, how would you define the essential characteristic of Honor Harrington? What is the one thing that you would say was the central facet of her character? And I said, well, I hadn't really thought about it until you asked me, but probably the central facet of Honor Harrington's character, and most of my protagonists, especially my heroes, is that they are responsibility takers. If they see a problem that they can deal with, they don't care about whether or not it's their job to deal with it. It's their job to deal with it just because they can. And I think that probably is the central tenet of my personal soapbox, is the need to take responsibility and to own responsibility. And I think that really, really resonates with the 21st century American readership, because we feel so many people don't. And I'm not talking just about politicians in this case. I'm talking about an entire culture in which sometimes we look around and we feel like nobody takes responsibility for anything. When the truth is that there are plenty of people out there who are taking responsibility, just as much as an Honor Harrington. But nobody tells us about them. And so I think one of the things that resonates with my readers is the fact that I do tell them about the people like that. People who I've known and people who I've never met, but do exactly that. Now, that's probably about enough on my philosophy of writing. Just for those of you who are interested in knowing where I am right now on the writing, I am working on the sequel to Shadow of Freedom. I am planning on wrapping up the Honor Harrington basic storyline in the next 2 books. I am actually going to finish a series. I'm going to be able to have on my tombstone, he finished a series. If I do it right, the final book will be released in April of 2018, which will be exactly 25 years after Basilisk Station was released, which I think will kind of round it off nicely. That doesn't mean there will not be any more Honorverse stories. There will. But I will be able to kind of set the storyline that began in Basilisk Station aside, because it will be done. That doesn't mean that they are going to figure out where the Mason alignment is and kill it, okay? It just means that that story will be done. And if somebody figures out, it'll have to come later on, you know. Yeah, I may let them figure it out. I may not, you know. One of the things authors get to do is torment their characters. I have gosh, I think it's the 8th Safehold book is coming out in October, Hell's Foundation's Quiver. We are going to do a Safehold anthology along the lines of the Honorverse anthologies. And I plan on wrapping up the current Safehold story arc, not in Hell's Foundation's Quiver, but in the book that will follow that one. And then there will be a hiatus on Safehold for probably 20 years. And then we'll start all over again, but both sides will have steam and rifled guns and stuff, so it'll be much nastier. Like I said, you have to torment your characters. Let's see, what else is going on here? Joelle Presby and I recently finished like 6 months ago now, finished the 3rd volume in what I think of as the Multiverse series, Hell's Gate and Hell Hath No Fury. This one is The Road to Hell. I don't think I have a scheduled release date for that one yet, but Joelle and I are planning at least one more book after that one. And Jane and I have had a lot of inquiries from readers who want to know if there are going to be any more of the Stephanie Herrington Tree Cat books. We hope there will. Tony likes the books. Yes, my daughter Morgan wants to know where book 4 is. And when I told her we don't have a contract for it yet, she said, why not? And I said, well, the sales figures are better for the Honor Harrington books. Yeah, but I'm sorry, honey, we're trying to convince Tony. She's trying to find the number. She said, yeah, but I said, I can't do it. She said, well, you could write it just for us. I was like, in my copious free time, I'll get right on that, kind of thing. But that's actually, it's a pretty good compliment, on the book. But we want to do more of those. And Tom Pope and Tim Zahn and I are doing a collaborative series also in the Honorverse, the Manticoran Ascendant series, which is about a character named Travis Lee, who I really like. And I am deliberately letting Tim take lead on writing these because they're set 300 years earlier than Honor Harrington, and I wanted a different feel for the books. And if you have ever read Tim Zahn, you know that you could not possibly be in better hands for someone else to be playing in your sandbox. So basically, we decide on the storyline together, and then I send Tim off to write with Tom as his technical consultant, because Tom is probably the only living human being who knows more about the Honorverse than I do. And I mean that seriously. He really is. And then when they have their rough draft, they bring it to me and I do that, ooh, this is good, don't know about that kind of thing for the final book. And every so often they'll kind of get stuck. They can't figure out how to solve something, so they'll come to me and Tom will say, well, they can't do that because we can't do it this way because of that, we can't do it. I said, Tom, whose universe is it? He says, yours. I said, have we actually nailed our feet to the ground anywhere in print that we can't do it that way? And he said, well, no, but it's in the Tech Bible. And I'm like, has the Tech Bible been published yet, Tom? He's like, no. And I said, okay, we can do it this way. It's kind of like, yeah, one of the advantages of being God, But I don't know. Sharon and I were at a con in Colorado many years ago, and there was a young lady, she was Chinese, and she had come in uniform as Honor Harrington, and she really had done a good job. And one of the members of the con committee was a family counselor in his mundane life. When he wasn't doing his real life organizing cons, he was a family counselor. So we did a counseling session at the con between David Weber and Honor Harrington. And at one point she's like, and he killed Paul just to increase readership. He doesn't care about me. And I'm like, see, that's what I got to put up with all the time. It's all about her. And we're about 45 minutes in, and Sharon stands up at the back of the auditorium and says, you stay away from my husband, you brazen hussy. And I thought it was probably one of the best panels we had done. Is that my 15-minute warning? I can't see it. Oh, we're down to 10. I couldn't see it for the lights. Uh-oh. All right, question and answer time. My phone went dead. Yes. I can't see. Yes.
So when I started reading Honor Harrington, one of the reasons that someone pointed it to me was I had finished Elizabeth Moon's Serrano series, and I said, where's more military science fiction with women portrayed well? And so I started reading, someone pointed it at me, your series, and I started reading that. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we've noticed over the time is you have women in roles where in traditional military science fiction, it's been seemed like there hasn't been good representation. You have people of color, you have strong disabled characters. Was that intentional on your part? Did you start out going, I want to put these characters that military sci-fi doesn't seem to represent well into my fiction? Or did it happen because those were the characters that came out?
That is a question I've never been able to answer. I never ever said, well, I should make Honor Harrington female because that'll be good, that'll work, Honor Harrington just was female. Now, I will say, if you look at all of my fiction, you will find strong female characters. When they're not the protagonists, you'll still find strong female characters. I like to think you'll find strong male characters, too. But I happen to like women, and I happen to like strong, competent human beings, and that means I like strong, competent women. And I think that one of the problems you get into, I've had people ask me, how do you write a strong female character? And my response is, I don't. I write a strong human being who happens to be female. And I will also say this, there are a whole bunch of cultures on the face of this planet who continue to cling to the notion that women are inferior and should not be allowed to do this, should not be allowed to do that. I can only say that I am very happy that in another 20 years, my children won't have to worry about competing with that culture, because 50% or more of the human race is female. And that means that 50% or more of the talent and capability of the human race is female. And if you want to close them out of your society, it is a crime against those women in your society, but your society is committing suicide compared to the rest of us. So it wasn't really an intentional theme in Honor Harrington, but it does represent something that I feel strongly about.
Hi, I'm an aspiring author myself, science fiction, and I was wondering about your decision to become an author. You said that you had been writing ever since you were in 5th grade, and you had tons of short stories that you never had published. Mm-hmm. What was it in your first novel that told you that you wanted this to be seen by others? Actually, it wasn't my first novel. My first novel was rejected many times and came out last month. In Sword of the South. So, the best revenge is getting published after all. What happened with Insurrection was that I realized that the continuity and the characters were so strong that they had to be given a complete novel to complete the story arc. Bob Aspirin was at a convention with me many, many years ago, and he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, Bob said a lot of things I did forget, but I didn't forget this one. He said, professional writers are like rats. If we don't wear our fingers down on the keyboard every day, our fangs grow through our brains and kill us. And I think there's truth to that. I think that any successful writer that I know probably would be writing for his own entertainment or her own entertainment, whether anybody was publishing. Isaac Asimov once said that his greatest fear was that the publishers would realize he'd write whether they paid him or not. And that's true for most of us that actually succeed at this. I don't know whether I answered your question, but I certainly scattergunned it. Okay.
Hi. I really appreciated seeing you at DragonCon last year. And you talked then about the possibility of an Honor Harrington movie. And I was hoping you could comment or update us on any other properties in your various universes besides the books that.
Okay, well, the sad news about the Honor Harrington movie project is that Evergreen Studios has closed its doors. So that project is unfortunately gone. Now, the good news is that we've had several other inquiries about the property, including an inquiry from the producers of the series Bones. to do it as TV. And if any of you watch Bones, you know that they're certainly familiar with the concept of strong, capable female people. And I personally believe that in many ways the Honorverse would lend itself better to TV, high quality production value TV, than to cinema, because there are so many characters in it and it is so character driven. Huge cast. If you look at something like Ocean's 11 and whatnot, and you realize that they've actually managed to write that many main characters into the storyline, you realize what a phenomenal job they did in producing it. So I would love to see Honor in the movies someday, but I think we're more likely to see her on the small screen.
Well, I was going to ask about the Honor Harrington movie.
Sorry.
But
all right, you're done. You can't ask. Go ahead.
Let me ask instead about what was your reaction to how the Honor Harrington Fan Association has taken off over
the
past,
TRMN?
Yeah.
You have no ulterior motive in asking that question.
And do other authors have similar organizations?
Oh, sure. If you've
fans
ever
who
seen
dress
Lois
up?
with the Dindari Mercenaries, okay? I mean, you guys are kind of, okay, let me put it to you this way. The greatest compliment that anybody can pay a writer is to invest in that writer's world, to come want to live there for a little bit. That is that's the ultimate gratification to an author, what tells him that he got it right, okay? And so from that perspective, a fan club like the TRMN is a huge professional compliment. Having said that, the people that I've met in the TRMN are a remarkable crowd. And they are very, very protective of Sharon and me and the kids at conventions. It's like having 4,000 close personal friends, okay? And it's been something that I have appreciated a great deal. Okay. Are we out? Oh, we got 2 minutes, okay.
Okay.
So I have to do this or I can't read it.
How much research went into the Harrington series? I mean, I know that the Manticore is a completely new world, but it's obviously based on Britain. And it looks, and from what little I know, it looks like you did a very good job of at least copying, I think, the terms I think that the British Navy actually uses as far as titles go. I think at one point, I think in Basilisk, I think you even mentioned, I think, question time, which is actually used in the British constitutional system. Do you get any, how much research you did, what feedback have you gotten from British readers? And I'm off.
Well, okay, when I was doing my graduate work in history, back when I thought I was going to be a history teacher, I was dealing especially with Anglo-American history and Anglo-American relations. So that's part of it. The other part was you have to realize that Manticore actually represents what a bunch of people 800 years down the road from Britain thought the British system was, not what it really was. I have found that my historical training has been a huge, huge benefit to me in writing science fiction. Building worlds, which is a huge, huge part of taking your readership with you in science fiction or fantasy, requires an understanding of how worlds work, how societies and cultures work, how historical processes work. And even if there are elements, you may not believe this given the infamous info dumps that occur in some of my books, there's a lot of background information on the Manticoran universe that I've never given you, but that's there and that underlies and supports everything that I do. Oh, time is up. So I gotta go. Thank y'all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.